Hey folks, and welcome to the second in a series of guides going over Resto Druids and how to squeeze out the best DPS from the spec. Up first, however, is the second part of an introduction. Last time we covered what Resto DPS is and why it can be important, and now we will be covering the beginner's how to, and also when. It might be long, but it's handy to know, so let's get started. To begin with, we're going to cover the first steps of performing damage as a Resto Druid. To push this to the next levels, known as Catweaving or Owlweaving, you need to take these talents of Feral or Balance Affinity. However, for this introduction, we will be ignoring those and only covering the beginner's first steps. Regardless of whether you take these talents, you are going to be using the spells listed here probably more than any others. Whether you've just leveled a Resto Druid or recently had a 1% raid wipe and were looking to ways to help down it, we are going to look at the 3 spells you can cast in your humanoid form, those being Moonfire, Sunfire, and far less important, Wrath. While you have access to other DPS abilities, they all require form changes, which won't be covered here, instead in their own Catweaving or Owlweaving guides. What is here is the simplest and most user-friendly approach, and yet surprisingly relevant. By staying in humanoid form, you have the safety net in case something happens, though it is worth noting there is no global cooldown for returning to humanoid form, so you can cast spells instantly to get out of cat form or moonkin form. There is a GCD when shifting either to cat or moonkin form, however, which means you need to know in advance you'll have the time, whereas if you stay in humanoid form you can deal the damage instantly, while you get the hang of knowing when you can deal damage. Unlike some other healers, our damaging abilities are all separate from your healing. They do not interact with each other. Luckily, we do have benefits over those healers because of not only our healing style being heal over time effects, or HOTS, but our primary damage being damage over time, or DOTS. This means that we can often keep both rolling at the same time. In any setting with more than one enemy, Sunfire is your best DPS ability. In fact, it is so good that it is a good reason for Resto Druid's popularity in Mythic Plus. For a global cooldown, you can apply a dot to every target in the group you are fighting. Moonfire is more efficient on a single target, but it has to be cast manually, but if you can afford the time, it will be worth casting it on 5 other targets. The order you cast them though does not make a huge difference. Overall, the key to Resto Druid is maintaining these 2 dots on as many targets as possible with as much uptime as possible, unless those targets are going to die in a few seconds. To give some context for how powerful these are, the optimal rotation if using Feral Affinity is to leave cat form in order to cast these abilities. They are that good. By keeping just these 2 dots up, you will be doing over half of your maximum DPS for very little effort. And effort is actually key for a healer doing damage. While damage dealers care about damage per second, healers need to be efficient. We care about damage per cast time. In WoW's history, the best damage per cast time abilities have normally been instant cast dots, and we have 2 of them. This means if you can spend 2 global cooldowns every 20 seconds keeping these up, you'll be doing about a 1/6 to a 1/5 of a DPS player's damage. But unlike those players who spend all of their time doing so, you will only spend a 1/10 of your global cooldowns. That makes you more efficient than other DPS players. And what do you do during the times that you cannot cast Moonfire or Sunfire? Obviously not refreshing them, instead it would be healing or other damage. As a healer, healing will likely be what you are doing. Let Moonfire and Sunfire do most of the work. Of course, there are sometimes there is nothing to heal, so just make like you are level 1 again and Wrath. Wrath is much worse than your dots, but it is simple and at any time you can cancel the cast to resume healing. If you want more efficient damage dealing, you'll of course have to delve into Catweaving or Owlweaving, which will be in our own videos. If you want to dip your toes in, Balance Affinity is easier to get started in, and better if you do not spend much time dealing damage. Practice shifting into Moonkin and using Star Surge when the time allows. Last to mention is Tranvoke the Spirits, the Night Fae Druid ability. If you are in Cat or Moonkin forms, you can use these in those forms for an efficient damage dealing ability. Just be aware that when used in humanoid form it will prioritise healing, and many encounters and dungeons you'll want to save this for healing purposes. Now, in keeping with the theme of efficiency, let's look at when to DPS, because it is actually the most important skill in doing good numbers. Unlike DPS players who spend all of their time dealing damage, you need to identify when you can deal damage, and when you need to heal. Letting someone die will cost the group far more damage than you throwing out a wrath. Just like healing as a druid, the key knowledge required here is the encounter. Already Resto Druids want to know when the damage is coming in, so we can hot up targets beforehand. We don't do so well reacting to the unknown. The same is true for dealing damage, so let's look at some example boss mechanics and dungeon scenarios. A good first rule is right at the start of the encounter. If the tank has hots rolling and everyone is full, on the pull, use your dots. You don't need to throw out a heal for the first few seconds most likely, so why not use Moonfire and Sunfire? The same can be said for dungeon packs, especially as Sunfire is so efficient, but be aware dungeon packs can burst down your tank a lot quicker than raid bosses can. Another reason to use them at the start is that you will often have the mana to spend. Later on you'll be struggling for mana, and Moonfire and Sunfire do cost you mana, and there are times that you won't want to use it if you need to conserve mana. But at the start, your mana will probably end up going up to 100 before you start properly healing. Speaking of dungeon packs, stuns. We may not have many ourselves, but AoE stuns are very common, as is tank kiting. During these, if your group is in good health, you can toss out damage knowing that none will come back your way. With all the dungeon buffs from covenants and items around, these are even more common. Also relevant for dungeons is when the pack is down to a single mob or so. At this point the worst is likely over, the damage will be at its lowest, and the tank may even be able to sustain themselves. It is a good time to put out some damage. After all, you can heal up once the group is no longer in combat, but you can't deal damage once the group is out of combat. In raids and some dungeon bosses, it's all about learning the damage patterns. In Castle Nathria, two good examples are Darkvein and Council of Blood, the end bosses of each of the early splits. For Darkvein, her raid damage is mainly from opening containers. At the start of the encounter, no containers will be open, so the damage on the raid is lower, so you can spend more time dealing damage. Once the encounters are opened, you can heal up, and then as the encounter approaches 10%, containers will be closed and raid damage will be low again. For Council of Blood, the raid gains a stacking dot the longer they go up without pushing a boss to 50% or death. At 1 to 2 stacks, this damage can be covered by a couple of spells from each healer or efflorescence, but as you get higher you'll need to dedicate more and more time to healing until it is non-stop. Other mechanics you may encounter might be roleplay from bosses such as N'Zoth, or vulnerability phases such as Sludge Fist. Some bosses stop dealing damage to channel some ground effects that you'll need to dodge. Moonfire and Sunfire are instant cast, and assuming your party is not getting hit, there will be no damage coming in. Understanding damage patterns is a key component to healing, and it's why always playing with the same tank will make it easier for you. You'll know when and how they take damage. The next step to healing is knowing when you need to heal and when you have the time to deal damage. And the best way is practice. Study the encounter, always think, is there damage coming in? Is the group healthy? Is anyone going to die if I cast Moonfire? Your damage numbers may seem small, but they all add up. Healers can contribute about 2% to 5% of a boss's health in a damage in a raid encounter, even more in dungeons where it can be, again, even higher. It may not seem like much, but many healers contribute no damage at all, and yet with a few efficient casts you can single-handedly shift 1% wipes into kills. Thank you for watching both of these introductions to dealing damage as a healer. As mentioned, there will be guides on both Feral Affinity and Balance Affinity, so you can learn to take these first steps into contributing the best you can to the damage cause, while keeping everyone safe and healthy.